In this lecture, we're going to cover elbow and forearm anatomy. Overall, the elbow is not an overly difficult joint when it comes to actual anatomy. Pretty straightforward, not a ton of structures, but do make sure that you understand what's going on. So starting off this first part, we're going to cover all the bones and bony prominences that you're going to have to know. 3 bones do make up the elbow joint. We have the humerus, which is going to be the proximal part of the joint, and then we have our radius and ulna that are going to be together distally. We're going to cover, so these are the 3 main bones, your humerus, your radius, and your ulna. So just kind of an overview here. There's specific stuff on the next picture, but to kind of tell a difference of where you're at, when you look at a humerus, the medial epicondyle is way more pronounced than the lateral epicondyle. And then we can tell anterior to posterior because the anterior side, you can see this really round-shaped capitulum here, and there are 2 fossas on the anterior side of the humerus. Then on the back side, the posterior side, all you can see is the trochlea and 1 large fossa for the olecranon fossa. Understanding the radius and the ulna, they're very easy to tell apart. The radius is going to have a very round-shaped top, and it's going to be shorter than the ulna. The ulna is going to have this very pronounced olecranon process, where it actually kind of wraps around the humerus. So again, we'll go into detail of all of these. So all the structures that are listed in the boxes are the ones that I want you to know. So when we look at the distal humerus here, again, here is our anterior side, because you can tell we're anterior, because here's our capitulum, here's our trochlea, and we have our 2 fossas. This is our posterior side, because all you can see is the trochlea and 1 large olecranon fossa. I've already mentioned on the previous slide that your medial epicondyle is much more pronounced than your lateral epicondyle. In this case, our medial epicondyle is going to be over here. Again, way larger and easier to palpate than your lateral epicondyle. And again, here's your laterals larger from the back, but it's still, the medial is way more pronounced when you actually go to palpate. The trochlea is going to be this kind of hourglass shaped structure that you can see on both anterior and posterior aspects. This is what the olecranon of the ulna is going to wrap around. So in order for us to do elbow flexion and extension, we have this the trochlea here is one part of that joint, and then we have the ulna. The olecranon process of the ulna is going to actually wrap around that as we go flexion and extension. The capitulum is only on the anterior side. I already mentioned that. It's this ball-shaped structure, only on the anterior side, and it is going to be articulating with the radius. So the radial head is going to actually butt up against this, and that's where we can actually get our supination and pronation as well as flexion and extension. And again, we'll go into that in more detail. Then we have several fossas. On the anterior side, we have our coronoid fossa. So whenever we see the term fossa, think of an indentation or kind of a hole. So on the anterior side, we have a coronoid fossa, and the coronoid fossa is going to accept the coronoid process of the ulna. So the ulna is going to be coming up here in a few slides, but the coronoid process is a pointy part on the ulna. So when we go into full flexion, because it's a point, it has to have somewhere to go. So we have this fossa here to accept the coronoid process. We also have our radial fossa also on the anterior side. When we go into full flexion, we have to make room for the radial head. So now we have a hole to accept the radial head. On the back, we have a very large and deep olecranon fossa, and it's going to be responsible for accepting the olecranon process. So giving you a different picture here, this is an anterior side. Here is the medial epicondyle, which is large. Here's your capitulum. Here's your trochlea, your coronoid fossa, and your radial fossa. In full flexion, we have to have these fossas, like I said before, because the radial head is going to slide into the radial fossa, and the and the coronoid process is going to slide into the coronoid fossa. If we did not have these structures, these fossas, we would not be able to achieve our full flexion. So in order for us to get that full flexion, we have to have somewhere for this bony prominences to go, and they go into the fossas. Same thing on the back side, which is on the next slide here. Here's our trochlea, which is where our olecranon wraps around. Then we have the olecranon fossa here, where when we go into full extension in this case, we have to have somewhere for the the olecranon process to go. So we have the olecranon fossa. Looking at the ulna here, so like I said, the ulna is very easy to recognize because it has this big giant crescent shape part at the top. This entire area is called the olecranon. This top part here, the actual pointy part, is called the olecranon process. And here is the coronoid process. So it is the pointy part, but it's opposite of the olecranon process. Overall, this is the olecranon. Here's your olecranon process is the pointy part, and your coronoid process is the other part. We do have a trochlear notch. In this picture, it's hard to tell, but it actually, let me get my pen here. I'll show you what it looks like. If we actually cut this in half and looked at it from the top down, it actually looks like that. So this part right here is going to be your trochlear notch. So you can't really tell, but in here, that's what this is. So we have this W shaped where that's where it's able to work with the trochlea. So the trochlea is sitting here. The trochlea, like I said, is that hourglass shaped thing, and it looks like that on the humerus, and it's able to keep it in place. So instead of just being flat and having a flat structure, it actually has that ridge in the middle to keep the humerus aligned with the ulna. So that is your trochlear or semilunar notch. Then we also have the radial notch. And the radial notch is on the ulna, so this is where it kind of gets confusing. But we do have a radial notch on the ulna, and this is where the radial head is going to sit right next to the ulna. So when we look at these two together in a couple slides, we'll see that the radial head is actually sitting in the radial notch on the ulna. So the radial notch is for the radial head, but it's on the ulna. Here's your proximal radius. Like I said, it's also very easy to figure out. The radius has this round-shaped head at the top. Then we have the neck of the radius here in the middle, and then we have close to the head and neck, we have the radial tuberosity, or also called the bicipital tuberosity, and it's called the bicipital tuberosity because that is where the biceps tendon is going to insert. So pretty straightforward. Do have an idea of what this looks like, so it all makes sense when we put them all together. So when they actually sit in there, we have the olecranon, we have the trochlea, then we have the radial head sitting next to the ulna, and the radial head is going to butt up against the capitulum, and the ulna is going to wrap around the trochlea. And again, just some more pictures for you to take a look at. Close-ups here of the anterior and posterior view with these three bones together, and I really like these pictures because it really, I think, does a good job showing what all this looks like. But again, your capitulum is very round, and the cool thing about the radius is it has this head to it, but it also is concave. It's indented here. So because it's indented, it's going to sit right up next to the capitulum, and we're going to be able to do flexion and extension as well as supination and pronation. So the rotation that we have in our forearm, that supination pronation, is because of how the radius is formed, and we have that rotation occurring around the capitulum. And then again, here's a close-up of how the radial head butts up right next to the ulna. It's actually sitting on the ulna, on that radial notch of the ulna. And then here is your capitulum, that pointy structure. So you can see that when it's in full flexion, it's going to go into the coronoid fossa. Then we have, it's not as deep, and it's harder to see actually, but this is your radial fossa, so that the radial head that kind of sticks out when we go into full flexion will go into your radial fossa here. On the posterior side, you can see that this is in full extension, so that the olecranon process is all the way into the olecranon fossa. Looking at the medial and lateral views, and again, I like these pictures as well. This is a lateral view. The radius is on the lateral side. I always remember when you're in anatomical position, the radius is thumb side, so that is going to always be lateral. The ulna is always going to be positioned medial. No matter how your hand is, the radius is going to be lateral. Your ulna is medial. So you have your lateral epicondyle, then we have the distal part of the humerus, and here is your capitulum, and it doesn't look as much like a ball here from the lateral view, but you can definitely tell that from the anterior view. But you can in this picture see the formation of the radial head and how that kind of sticks out and how you need that radial fossa, because this is a little bit pointy right here. And you can also see in this picture how the radial head is concave and it butts up against the capitulum. We also have our radial tuberosity or bicipital tuberosity right here, where the biceps tendon is going to come down and insert into that bump right there. On the medial side, you have a very pronounced medial epicondyle. You can still see some of the radial head as it bumps up against the ulna, but you can definitely get a good picture of what this olecranon looks like completely wrapped around the trochlea. So you have your coronoid process, your entire olecranon, and then at the back here, your olecranon process. Now when this goes into full flexion, the coronoid process will go into the coronoid fossa. When we go into full extension, the olecranon process will go into the olecranon fossa. And this is going to look. This is a good picture for a reference because there's no ligaments on here, because we're going to be looking at the ligaments of that wrap around these joints. So have a good idea what the bones look like and how they fit together, and then understanding the ligaments will be a little bit easier. The annular ligament, I think, is a very cool ligament. This is it's one of those ligaments that starts and ends on the same bone. It's got a very important job, but it does not necessarily connect two bones in the traditional way a ligament does. The annular ligament is going to act like a sling, and what it's going to do, it's going to start on the ulna, and it's going to create an entire circle, and then it's going to end on the ulna. So we have this all is considered the annular ligament. And this part right here is your radial notch that's on the ulna. So if we include the radial notch plus the entire annular ligament, we're going to get a complete circle. And that complete circle is going to totally surround the radial head. So this annular ligament is what's going to keep the radial head in place. The interesting thing is that there are actually no fibers on the annular ligament. They do not insert into the radial head. They wrap around it, they hold it in place, but they do not actually insert into the radial head. And that's good because it acts like a sling and it holds it in place, we're able to have that supination and pronation as well as flexion and extension. If the annular ligament actually attached into the radial head, we would not be able to do rotation. We would not be able to have supination and pronation of our forearm. So this is a ligament. It starts on the ulna, it ends on the ulna. It's made up of just dense connective tissue, but it is responsible for holding the radial head next to the ulna and allowing for that rotation to occur. And here's a view of it from the top here, how you can see it starts on the ulna and it's going to wrap all the way around into a complete circle and end on the back side of the ulna. Again, here's another picture of how it wraps around that radial head. This is going to permit supination and pronation of the radius, like I said. If we're in full supination, so that palms up position, the anterior fibers of the annular ligament are going to be taut. If we are in full pronation, so palms down, then the posterior fibers of the annular ligament are going to be taut. So you can kind of tell if the annular ligament's involved if supination and pronation hurt. Looking at the lateral structures here, we have the radial collateral ligament, and I tend to call it the RCL. You will find some sources that call it the lateral collateral ligament or the LCL. Either one is correct, but I tend to call it the radial collateral because the LCL, when you say LCL, you tend to think of the knee versus the elbow. Again, both are acceptable, but I prefer the term radial collateral ligament, so that's what I'll be using. The RCL is not overly strong. We've talked about these kind of ligaments before where they're really just thickenings of the joint capsule. So it's not, the annular ligament is a very obvious type of ligament, dense connective tissue that's formed for one major purpose. The radial collateral ligament is just kind of a thickened area of the joint capsule. It is actually going to start on the lateral epicondyle. It's going to originate up here, and it's going to run down, and it's going to insert into the annular ligament. So it starts on a bone of the humerus, the lateral epicondyle, and it actually inserts into the fibers of the annular ligament. So it starts on a bone, inserts into a ligament. Those two are connected, so if one is hurt, the other may be involved. So if you damage your RCL, there may be a chance that you also have damage to your annular ligament, and vice versa. The radial collateral ligament, the RCL, its primary job is to resist varus force. When we're talking about extremities, a varus force is one that comes from the inside out. And this is kind of hard to explain, but basically, without showing you, but basically, if you had your arm straight out in front of you in a locked position, if you get hit on the medial side of your elbow, that is a varus force. So it's going to end up hitting you on the medial side and then putting stress on the lateral side. spraining your RCL and possibly your annular ligament. Also on the lateral side, we have a lateral ulnar collateral ligament. So we're going to have a regular ulnar collateral ligament, but this one is the lateral ulnar collateral ligament. I'm not really sure why they didn't change the name, but this ligament does not touch the radius. So up here we had our radial-collateral ligament, here's our annular ligament, and down here, running from the humerus, the lateral epicondyle, down to the ulna is a collateral ligament. So collateral means on the side. This is just going to run from the humerus to the ulna, so it's still called ulnar collateral. So you just have to be very specific when you're talking about this ligament. Fortunately, this is a very strong lateral stabilizer, but it tends to do a lot more work with rotary stability versus preventing varus force. So it does help with the overall lateral stabilization, but does a lot in terms of the rotation in the elbow. But it does run from the lateral epicondyle down to the ulna. It does not touch the radius, so when you go to palpate this, you have to make sure you're palpating the lateral epicondyle and you actually go under the radius versus directly on top of the radial head, because if you palpate on top of the radial head, you are not going to be touching the lateral UCL. Then we have our regular UCL. This is also called the medial collateral ligament, but just like with the lateral collateral ligament, I tend to call it ulnar collateral because we know we're talking about the elbow at that point versus the knee, because there is an MCL in the knee as well. When we talk about UCLs, we're talking about this one. This is one of the primary injuries when we see elbow injuries, especially in acute. So this is kind of like everybody gets an ACL tear. Well, when you come to especially baseball players, people are getting UCL tears. So it's a relatively common injury, but it's still pretty serious. The ulnar collateral ligament is the primary stabilizer, is the only stabilizer on the medial side of the elbow. It is broken up into 3 different parts. We have our anterior bundle here in red. So this whole entire thing, all 3 of these colors, are all parts of the ulnar collateral ligament. So there are 3 parts to it. The anterior bundle here in red runs from the ulnar collateral ligament, runs from the medial epicondyle down to the coronoid process. So when we go to start palpating this stuff, you have to know where you're at. So in order to find the proper branches of the UCL, you have to palpate the medial epicondyle and then follow it to the coronoid process. Now that's moving somewhat anterior, so you have to make sure you're pressing in the right spot. The anterior bundle of the UCL is the primary restraint against valgus force. So I just talked about varus force and how varus force is, when it's applied to an extremity, it is from the inside out. Well, a valgus force is a force applied to an extremity from the outside in. So when your arm is extended and your elbow is straight and you get hit on the outside, it ends up stressing the structures on the medial side, and that's how you actually sprain a UCL. So the entire job overall of the UCL is to prevent valgus force, or prevent that from causing injury. Like many ligaments, whatever their job is, that's actually how you hurt them. So if the UCL's job is to prevent excessive valgus force, well, excessive valgus force is what's going to end up spraining or tearing a UCL. So the anterior bundle is the most important. It provides the most stability, and it's going to be taut through the entire range of motion. So it's taut no matter what position that we're in. The posterior bundle is the one here in blue. It's more of a fan-shaped. It's wider. It's not near as strong. It does provide stability. It runs from the medial epicondyle down to the olecranon. So if you remember how I said before, that view of the medial and lateral joint, reference that when you're looking at this. But it runs from the medial epicondyle down, and it actually touches most parts of the olecranon. So it's going to actually, you can't see it because the transverse bundle is in the way, but it's going to come down all the way over here. It's going to provide some stability, but it primarily works in stabilizing when we have more than 60 degrees of flexion. So not so much when we're less than 60 degrees, but it becomes taut and actually helps against valgus force if you're in more than 60 degrees of flexion. Then the last part is our transverse or oblique bundle. This one is one of those ligaments that starts on one part of the bone and ends on the same bone but a different part. So it does not actually connect two separate bones, where this connects the humerus and ulna, this one is humerus and ulna, this one goes from ulna to ulna. So it's the same part of the bone. What it actually does, it doesn't really support against any kind of valgus force, but it kind of just deepens that socket, deepens that joint, adds some fibers here at the bottom so that the elbow has a little bit more stability to it. So it's going to start on the olecranon back here, and it's going to run up to the coronoid process. So the olecranon is on the ulna, and the coronoid process is on the ulna. So it does not actually cross the elbow joint. When we do special tests, we're not going to be stressing the transverse bundle because when you pull two bones apart, you're not going to affect this ligament. So this one tends to not be injured because it doesn't really do anything. Valgus force really won't affect the transverse ligament. So it provides little to no support against valgus force, but it does help overall stability of the medial part of the elbow. So getting a different view here, here's our anterior bundle. That's the biggest, the thickest, and taut throughout range of motion. Here's our fan-shaped posterior bundle. It's not going to be as strong, and it's going to be taut from more than 60 degrees. And then here is your transverse bundle running from the olecranon up to the coronoid process, not actually crossing the joint. Here's a picture of, again, the RCL. The RCL is going to start on the lateral epicondyle, and it's going to actually insert into the annular. So this is a good picture that shows you that the fibers of the RCL actually insert into the annular ligament. So those two are connected. And then finally here, the interosseous membrane. We are focusing this chapter pretty much on the elbow and some of the forearm, but the radius and ulna both also affect the wrist. So within the forearm here, we have this structure called the interosseous membrane. This is very dense connective tissue. The fibers are going to run at an angle, and the job of the interosseous membrane is to not only hold the radius and ulna together, but it's also there to help dissipate force. So if you look down, we haven't covered this yet, but if you look down here, this is where the wrist is going to be. The wrist actually lines up and articulates with the radius. So when you look at the radius and ulna, the radius is small proximally, and the ulna is big proximally. Distally, down by the wrist, the radius is big, and the ulna is small. So they switch which one's bigger, depending on if you're proximal or distal. So when the wrist bones are all going to articulate with just the radius. We actually have no articulation of the wrist bones or hand with the ulna. So the whole point of this interosseous membrane is to help keep the bones together and to help dissipate force. So when I fall on an outstretched hand, so I fall on my hand, all the force is coming from my hand through my wrist, then it's going to go through the radius. Well, the radius does not want to take all of the force, so because they're connected through the interosseous membrane, as the force transmits up the radius, it actually starts to share force with the ulna. So then we're going to have forces traveling up the radius and traveling up the ulna until we get to the elbow, and then together they're both going to transmit force to the humerus. So we're able to help dissipate the force, so not all of that is going through the radius, because that's a lot of force and you're going to be susceptible to fracture. So we're trying to help share that force to accept it better. If we didn't have that, we'd have a lot higher incidence of fractured radiuses.